Good morning, friends. Welcome to the CEC live lectures, and we are running a series, as you know, on Indian writing and English translation. It's a vast area covering Indian writing, Indian literature from the ancient period to the modern times. And even if we don't have, in documentary form, the ancient literature, we have now available with us in the 20th century the literature of the ancient period as well as its translation in English. And since through English we are reaching the wider world level audience, therefore this series has a particular significance. In this series we have covered most of the important trends that were there in Indian writing and were available in English translation. And now we are towards the end of the series, and we are focusing upon what has been written in the last 50 years post-independence and the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And for today's lecture, we have Dr. Richa Bajaj. She teaches English literature in Hindu College, Delhi University, and she has worked on contemporary Indian writing, and her book that is on Bhakti Bodh in our time has been widely appreciated by the audience. And she is today talking on the topic contemporary poetry in Bengal. And by contemporary, what is meant is that writing which was written post-independence and which is current even today. So I request Dr. Richa Bajaj to give a lecture on this aspect. And welcome, Dr. Richa Bajaj, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome, viewers. Today we will discuss the poetry that is written in Bengal, in the 20th century. And so, looking at the evolution and the way Bengali poetry has formed itself in the 20th century. So, this will be largely the topic for today, and I will discuss a couple of poets in this particular regard. Now, as we think of Bengali poetry, then we look at the roots first. So, when we look at the roots, what do we actually find? We find that Bengal has had its cult, of the ball songs or even the ancient verses. In the medieval period, you had the Sufi cult as well. So, the balls and the Sufis were there in the medieval period. But as you move into what we call something like modern Bengali poetry, is something that begins particularly in the 19th century. Now, in the 18th century, we've had social reformers who have been working for, for making society a better place to live in the respect of, getting rid of caste hierarchies and orthodoxies in society. So, these reformers in a way stimulated the environment, the Bengali intellectual environment, and created a new kind of sensibility at the time. But then in the 19th century, the first name that comes to mind when one talks about modern Bengali poetry would be of Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Now, he was a convert, of course, who converted to Christianity as a kind of a rebel, not out of any kind of religious devotion or anything, but he was more of a rebel, and he traveled in different places and returned to Bengal. And then sort of when he came back, that's when he actually started writing about what Bengal means to him. And so when he writes, about this kind of Bengali life, he says, and I will quote from, Madhusudan Dutt, so that it becomes a kind of a base for us to actually understand what poets are going to write about in the later centuries. So, Madhusudan Dutt says in Banga Bhasha, he says, "O Bengal, many jeweled, all the treasures of your store in folly I ignored. In befuddlement of mind, craving foreign riches, I roamed abroad and wore the guise of a beggar, unhappily self-assigned. Long days I wasted, leaving happiness behind, sleeplessness and hunger of mind and body bore, followed barren rules, honored the unrefined, forgot the lotus pool to play with Moses by the shore. The spirit of your house in a vision called me then, O my child, unnumbered treasures are in your mother's hoard. Why then as a beggar are you wandering abroad? Turn back, misguided child, and find your home again. Gladly I obeyed, and so at last, with clearer sight, in my mother tongue discovered depths of beauty, jewel bright. Now, this is a kind of return to one's motherland, to one's nation, to Bengal, and Bengal, for all these poets that we are going to discuss, is a kind of is seen in the image of a mother, but also seen as a place of abundance and plenitude. We of course know, because of the region itself, because of ample rainfall, and because of being near the coastline, there is a kind of abundance of food. There is a kind of a fertile place, and people who are the soft terrain itself, the soft humid terrain, in a way have made people more sensuous in that sense, and particularly the poets. When I read the poetry here, at least when we are talking about the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, most of these poets are guided by the region. They are always the presence of nature, the presence of the region is very strong in them, whether it is the Bengali culture, tradition, or for that matter the trees and the particular the geography of the place. So it is very important for all of them, and they weave it into their poetry to speak about their experiences. So you see, from beginning then, going back to Michael Madhusudan Dutt, you find that from that moment, poetry actually gains a kind of a different approach. There is a kind of pride in the language, the vernacular language felt by the poets. And even as you have other writers, you have later on you have Bankim Chandra, who would also return to Bengal and look for tradition, Bengali tradition, and also then represented in one's work. Of course, the 19th century also saw what was called the Hindu Bengali nationalism, and that also became a cult in the period. But that was one aspect of Bengali life. The other secular aspect also kind of grew. And so in poetry, from after that, you have the period of Tagore, and when Tagore comes to the fore, then he is able to actually blend the religious and the secular, and also at the same time bring in nationalism very close to humanism. So that's a very happy blend that you see in Tagore, which while there were stark categories of Hindu Bengali nationalism on the one side, and on the other a different kind of poetry verging. But then Tagore tried to build these two aspects together and weave in poetry a new sensibility, and therefore Tagore's contribution in Bengali literature has been immense. And it is often said that only a Bengali knows what Tagore means to them. So in that sense, I feel that Tagore was able to blend the many cultures, also because he was a man of culture essentially, and he did not restrict himself to poetry. He was into writing novels, of course, and the plays that he wrote as a painter, as a musician. So you had this different this kind of all-encompassing epitome of culture that you had in Tagore. So Tagore, of course, became the voice of New Bengal, and because of Tagore, you find that Bengali poetry actually gained international recognition as well. So you see, these in a way defined the 19th century poetry for the people. It also defined Bengali culture for the people. So as we come to 20th century, Bengal has already become a place of cultural preeminence, and it has become a kind, and we've already reached a state of Bengali Renaissance that has already taken place and has now become the intellectual cultural hub. This is also the time when the intelligentsia in Bengal is growing, and so the modern Bengali intelligentsia then is looking at various aspects of life and evaluating life on their own terms. Now what happens in the 20th century, and I'm not focusing my lecture on Tagore because that has been covered in another lecture of ours. So I'm actually moving to the post-Tagorean phase where the new writers have to have to approach life with the influence of Tagore, but at the same time they are trying to break away from the tradition of Tagore. So in the 1920s and 30s, you have a different kind of poetry which is trying to break free from the overpowering presence of Tagore. Of course, Tagore for them meant this figure who could blend things very well, who was a very happy fusion of the Western and the Eastern ethos of rationality with a kind of mysticism. So while in Tagore you find a kind of a mystic religious blend, or for that matter you find in him the personal and the cosmic finding a kind of harmony in his poetry. His lyrics, his personal lyrics all try to work around the personal and the cosmic, and then finds unity there, and and mysticism is an important part of his writing. But these writers who are writing in the post-Tagorean phase, they are trying to approach reality differently, and they do not wish to talk about religious or mystical strains. In fact, they wish to register their anger, their protest. It's a kind of a rebellion that they're trying to project through their writings. Now, this is an important point that we need to understand. Why is it that poets, the figure of the poet rebel, in fact, comes to the fore in this particular period? Now, we need to understand why that happened, in the sense that what caused these young writers to talk about their frustrations and anger, and talk about disorder and not order. What Tagore stood for was order, and obviously he envisioned a place where this kind of order could be brought in, where the East happily meets the West, where the cosmic meets the personal, where the religious and the mystical can be united. So there was always this kind of organized, or this kind of order that Tagore visualized. But these writers in the 1920s and 30s are trying to talk about disorder, are trying to talk about the protest and rebellion. They're also bringing in some violent images in their poetry. Now, often it is said that Tagore also in his later phase turned to this kind of writing, but these it is pronounced in the writers of 1920s and 30s, and you see it goes in again. This kind of writing goes in two different directions. Now, on the one hand, you have in the 1920s writers like the poet that we are discussing. You have the poet like I'll just talk about Qazi Nazrul Islam, who actually talks about in the 1920s a kind of freedom, hope for freedom, and at the same time talks about himself as a kind of storm. And here, when I read some sections from the poems, you will understand what I am trying to say. So, when we are talking about Qazi Nazrul Islam, then of course we are talking about the early 20th, and he becomes a very famous personality in the 1920s. So, at this particular time, you notice what he's trying to say, what the poet is trying to register here. He says in the poem, "An Invocation, why this lament, O brother? The good old days that we have lost will dawn again in India. This land that has been turned into a desert, trampled and parched dry, will blossom again into a garden and a smile. Weep not, be not daunted. Strength will return to this soul of ours that is rent asunder by pain. Also, on the top of this withered plant of life, the greenery of your new life will flutter in fullness of expression. Should the spring of life reign again on the peacock throne of the flower garden, this our head, even this head, will be adorned with the crown of flowers." So, you can see there is a kind of hope that the writer, that the poet here is trying to build. And what kind of hope is he trying to build? It's the hope for freedom, it's a hope for a new dawn that the country is bound to see at the time of the independence that the country will receive. Now, this is the point that the new poet is trying to register. The new poet is particularly interested in bringing hope and optimism, but not talking about some surreal details, not talk about mysticism. The poet is talking about real social issues, and keeping them in mind is trying to build hope for the generation. Now, when we are talking about Qazi Nazrul Islam, then this is very true of his poetry. Often he is seen as a poet of propaganda, but or he is more prose-like in his poetry and does not follow a very a lyric form per se. In fact, some of his poems are written as sentences, and they often feel like just essays that have been written. But so he's not. The point is that the poet is not here bothered so much about poetic diction, or for that matter, the verse form that he's employing. He's not even trying to be lyrical or sing a song for the readers. So of course, when you work on this kind of a thing, then you realize that his end is not really to give you a kind of pleasure, but to motivate and to, in a way, force the people out of their homes to come and join the movement for the struggle for independence of the country. So this is one example. The other one, when where he actually pokes the reader and pokes his countrymen to, and asks them to take a stand for truth or untruth and be on the side of truth. So the poem is titled here, "The Message of the Rebel." He says, "I beseech you, now is the time for you to speak the truth, the truth. You have done enough hushing up, played enough false tricks. Now speak the truth. With something in your mind and something else on your lips. This your duplicity makes people laugh at you, lowers your prestige in the world. You have to rue your deceit and lower yourself in your own eyes. That explains your show of empty bravado. There's no sword in your sheath. That's why you have all become today plain cowards and cheats. You dare not speak the truth. How dare you claim to do real work? The hollow idiot has no sense of shame. Even a drizzle makes you rush indoors, you fools. Enough of your reasons. I know what is milk and what is water. Now I demand you speak the truth." So you can already see the tone that he has employed in this particular poem. He's goading the reader here to take a stand and to speak the truth, and not hide behind duplicity or hypocrisy, and not do lip service to the for the nation, but do actual work and come out into the world. And there he goes on again. He goes on to say, if I could just go on reading, "In your heart of hearts, you are always reckoning your gains and losses, but you say you want Swaraj. That's why the meaning of the word Swaraj is increasingly becoming quite elastic for you." So, how it has been also misappropriated, it has been misused. The word Swaraj is also something that here the poet is drawing our attention to. And he says, "India must be for Indians. They are afraid to speak out even that little. You call such fossils your leaders. You have to follow them. You who are new, just say, we do not want these people hoary with wisdom. They are every day emasculating the country in their own image. They don't want that we should be free." So, there is this kind of discontentment, and there is a kind of anger that you can see in this poem as well. Also directed towards the leaders, who may be misguiding them and who are not ready to plunge into the movement with their whole heart. And here you see then, Qazi Nazrul Islam actually calling people out. And, he's when we are talking about Qazi Nazrul Islam, we find in his poetry an attack on both Hindu and Muslim orthodoxy and bigotry. bigotry. He's against them. He calls for this kind of equality. In fact, he's written many poems on equality, where he's talking about the equality between man and woman, equality between Hindu and Muslim, between all other religions as well. So you see, he's trying to build a case for equality through the practice of poetry. Now, this is the larger question, that how poetry in a way assisted writers at the time to fulfill the need and to fulfill and to fill that gap that was being created, that hollow propaganda could not put in. And at this point, I'd actually like Dr. Anand Prakash to give his views on how poetry in a way filled that space, important space for that other mediums could not.
No, I appreciate the point. Particularly striking for me was the departure that is made from Tagore tradition, which is the tradition of mysticism, of cosmic, of grandeur and all, and the 1920s poet onwards, because you have talked about the 1920s voice of Nazrul Islam. That is, drawing the reader, drawing the common person who will read his poetry or the poetry of other writers of his time to the earth, to the level of reality. And the reality in the 1920s, 30s and 40s is going to be political. And politics does not change unless the earth, is taken care of. So this is an important point, and departure from Tagore is something that is not said as clearly, but this is the point. I think your lecture then is on sound footing, because you are bringing in the aspect of life in its details. So I believe that this point should be made as you are making it, so that the new trends in Bengali poetry are identified. So I fully appreciate.
Yeah, in that sense, that is true. But also it is not entirely the case that in the post-Tagorean phase, writers move away from mysticism. In fact, when they are angry and they are rebellious, then it's of course I took the example of Nazrul Islam, but there are other writers who are responding differently to the situation, and they are trying to reject. I wouldn't say reject, but they're definitely trying to break away from the Tagorean influence that weighs heavy on them, and they do not wish to carry on in that manner. But what they instead choose in the 1930s, now I move to the 1930s, in this particular phase you find that writers choose a particular kind of modernism that is available in Europe. And so from breaking away from Tagore and then moving on to making their own kind of poetry, they look for other influences and they find them in the European model. So 1930s becomes a kind of a model for where people actually look up to writings of Eliot and Pound, and so the Western modernism in many ways influences the Bengali poetry of the 1930s.
You used two words. One was anger, the other was frustration, which was there in the 1920s. So you think that this also got connected in the 1930s and 40s with the Western modernism?
Yes.
Anger is there, frustration is there in modernism.
That is true, and therefore I say that that it wasn't exactly when they moved away from Tagore, then they went in another direction, not in the direction of social causes, or for that matter the social realism, or a kind of a committed writing that you find in Nazrul Islam, but the other kind of writing has tried to chart a different terrain. In the 1930s, that would be the case particularly.
What about this disillusionment? Is that also there? Because that is at the crux, at the core of modernism. Is that also there in Bengali poetry?
It is there. Disillusionment is there, but it's more of anarchy than anything, more than disillusionment. There is a kind of anarchy in their writing, that they don't wish to follow a particular trend, and they seem to be saying that we are experimenting with forms, and we are writing what we want to write. So they are, at this time, of course, they had other influences coming from the West. They were also influenced by Freud and Marx at the same time. Now, when Freud's ideas came to the fore, then there is a kind of eroticism in Bengali poetry that you see in the 1930s coming to the fore. And especially when we speak of Buddhadev Basu, then we find that he is using eroticism and sensuousness in a very different manner for creating a new kind of poetry. Whether that poetry has a social message, whether that poetry is meant for any social purpose or not, that is not the terrain of the poet.
What about sickness and boredom? That is also there in modern poetry. Did that enter the Bengali ethos, the Bengali mind?
There is boredom is, I don't see boredom in the poetry, at least in this part. I mean, when you talk about boredom, I'm certainly, I think of the post-independence period, and beyond that there is a sense of boredom that I see in some poems, and you know, there's a kind of weight that the poet carries. There is less boredom, but more of experience at the center. The poet is experiential in this phase, and enjoys but the joys of life, but also is exhausted in this particular venture. So
could you explain the influence of Freud in the 1930s, 40s?
Yes. So again, the whole idea that Freud influenced the Bengali poetry in a very different manner, because these poets who had read Freud were constituted the intelligentsia particularly. So in many ways they were the poet's poet, if one could say. They were writing for a particular audience as well. But they merged eroticism in the Bengali life, and which was already, as I mentioned earlier, that because Bengali poets have this sense of sensuousness and have this kind of, which perhaps from another point of view might be seen as effeminate as well, because of the region, because of the culture, because of their sensibility that gets attached to, which they have inherited from that region. So when they talk about eroticism, then they talk about the suppleness of the body as also of life. And that gets connected with plenitude as well.
Dr. Richa Bajaj, you have made these points, and you have very clearly identified the distinction between the earlier Tagorean and pre-Tagorean influences, and now things are moving in a different direction, and the direction is well captured, and we hope in the second part of the lecture you will be focusing still further on the concrete Bengali experience, as you call it. Thank you. Welcome back, friends, to the lecture, and already the point of 19th century ethos and the 20th century early writers, and then entering the area of contemporaneity, that has been covered. So the argument is now taken further by Dr. Richa Bajaj. So I will request her to, Richa, kindly proceed.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ananda. Viewers, we were discussing the kind of modernism that exists in the 1930s and that marks the Bengali poetry of the 1930s. In this respect, I wish to read two poems by Buddhadev Basu here, so you can have an idea, you get an idea about what kind of poetry is written around that period. So the first poem that I wish to read, and so you can just get a feel of the poet, is titled The Fire of Touch. On such a day, I can tell her on a rainy day like this, but there is nothing to say. Now there are no words to convey. Now only the signature of touch, the flaming fire of touch. Touch, touch, the pulp of fire. Now there is nothing to say. Now only the outburst of red flowers of touch. Why am I alone? Why this lament of rain's wind in my heart? Why are you alone? Why is your face so pale? Why this black flower of tiredness below your eyes? Why this wall of men in between us? This is the poem. Now there are three things that I want to talk about. The first is that of course there are two subjects involved. There is the man and the woman involved, and yet when they are together, then the poet is trying to project the feeling and the relationship that they share. And in this, the poet says, constantly refers to the word that gets repeated in the poem is nothing. That there is nothing to say, and now there are no words to convey, and only the signature of touch. So you see, it's the bond that one is trying to build is through touch, through experience, through feeling, through the palpable things. Again, the experience of being in the companion of the beloved here is being represented, and yet this kind of relationship is not based on intellectual kind of a harmony or this kind of in an intellectual connectedness, because one is never talking to the other, because there are no words to speak and there is nothing to say. So as they don't connect as two people who have thoughts, who have ideas, who have a set of things to say to one another. So that kind of connectedness is definitely blocked in the poem. What is in fact emphasized here is this kind of feeling of touch, or this experience of touch, that it is the kind of communication they build through touch. And so there is in fact a kind of a breakdown of communication between the two of them, and therefore the poet says that there is nothing that can be conveyed and no sense of communication is possible. This is essentially very Beckettian in many ways, because Beckett speaks of there is nothing to express, nothing with which to express. So there is this emphasis on nothingness in life, or nothing to say, because it's useless to talk, is something that is very, very significantly found in modernist writing. And here of course Buddhadev Basu is using that principle. And again, when they are in company of one another in this particular poem, then it is touch that binds them, and touch alone, as he says. And again the last stanza says, yet why am I alone? And why are you alone? So even companionship is not able to rid one of solitude. The solitude is of the personal kind is very pronounced in modernist writings. In fact, they value solitude so much that it's a kind of a precious thing that they hold dear. And here again, because solitude is perhaps something that brings you closer to yourself, but then it takes the poet inward, so much so that the poet forgets the outside world. In fact, the poet can't even, or the subject here in this particular poem can't even connect to the woman he's sitting beside, who and can only experience the touch that he feels in her company, and nothing beyond that. So this is the kind of modernism that we are referring to when we speak of Bengali poetry that has been influenced by Western modernism. Another poem of Buddhadev Basu that I wish to read here, again to give you the sense of what is the feeling of the poet at the time, what is the poet trying to convey to the reader. It's titled, In This Winter. If I could have perished in this winter, just as the tree dies and the snake lies lifeless throughout the long full winter, trees are born anew at the end of winter. New sap of life shoots up from their roots, lustrous green glistens on leaves and on countless defiant flowers. Now the point is that the poet here is talking about, if I could only have perished in this winter, just as the snake perishes or becomes lifeless throughout the winter, and I wish to do that, that to remain lifeless. So there is a kind of rejection of life itself that is being projected in this kind of poetry. Then in the same poem he says, why? Because they lie dead throughout the long full winter, because they know how to die. So it's a kind of a wishful thinking, or the poet wishes he knew how to die. There's a sense of that life itself is useless and worthless in the present situation. If I could have also remained dead, turned into absolute nothing, drowned into memoryless, dreamless, limitless sleep. So this is a kind of a very symptomatic kind of a modernism that you find here in this poem, because modernist writers generally they reject memory, they reject, and when you reject memory, really you're rejecting a kind of history that you've had. So these poets, when they reject memory, when you reject dreams, then you're also rejecting the very ethos of being a human being. And it's not something, so the quality that differentiates human beings from animals is that they are able to speak and use their intellect, and are able to memorize and write and use their history to understand the present situation better, and also to dream. That is essentially a human characteristic, and by denying or by rejecting dream, they are actually rejecting the future. In that sense, so there is a rejection of the past when they reject the memory. When he says memoryless, dreamless, then he is rejecting the future and he is rejecting the past as well. So this emphasis on the present where the poet is, and that too he defines the present as a feeling of wishful dying, is something that is that defines the modernist poetry of Bengal in this particular period. So this is something that I wanted you to have an idea of the kind of poetry that is being written at the time. Now when we talk about modernism, then there are different kinds of and we talk about experience related poetry, then there is a kind of difference. Now the other poet that I am going to speak to you about is Jibanananda Das. Now when we are talking about Jibanananda Das, then he is again the contemporary of Buddhadev Basu. He is of course he is senior to him, but then the kind of poetry he writes, it's it's based in Bengal. Again, the Bengali experience, just as the Bengali experience is very important, was very important for Madhusudan Dutt, you find that the poets keep returning to Bengal. Even Tagore talks about Bengal as a place where his heart is. Now here Jibanananda Das then talks about the experience of Bengali life and what Bengal means to him, and it is here in him he is more Keatsian in his approach, and in fact is a romantic in many ways. When he speaks about the place in his poem, I will come back again. He says, I will come back again to the Dhansiri banks, to this Bengal, perhaps not as a man, but as a Brahmani kite or Mayana dressed. Perhaps as a dawn crow, I'll come to this land of Kartik harvest, floating on the breast of mist to this jackfruit shade, one day I'll call. So, the poet seems to suggest that he'll come back to this land even when he's dead. He'll call on this land in the form of a bird or a duck or any form he takes. In fact, he says that, you might, perhaps you'll look and see a vulture on the evening breeze fly past, suggesting that he can also come back as a vulture. And all these, this kind of harmony that Tagore tried to build is in fact found in Das here in his poem, because he is also trying to talk about a kind of a personal harmony with nature and this kind of bond with the place that he is built, because he will keep coming back to the land. And he says finally, you will find me among these crowds. So experience takes a different form, very different from what you saw in Buddhadev Basu. You see a very different form in Jibanananda Das here as experience. This experience is the palpably felt experience of the poet and his relationship, this kind of intense passion that he has for his country or his land. Now the point is that then why do we call Jibanananda Das as a kind of existential or modernist poet? In what respect is he then modernist? Because he is not talking about nothingness in life. He certainly values the place and the experience that he has, but then the point is that he values his personal experience and does not wish to cross over. He does not make that experience that he has, connect with the experiences of people of that land. And again, his experience to the land has a kind of a very innate kind of logic to it, more like an intuitive sense that he builds with it. So, and by that logic, he's also then taken another path. He's rejecting the, so to speak, the social, life that has been built by people. So it's of course the relationship with the with one's country is that of a mother and the child, or as one who will keep returning to it and never lose touch. That kind of strong bond is there between the two. But this kind of bond is conspicuous by its absence when you look at other people around him. He's not able to build that bond with other people or with the society, and is not able to commit himself to this particular the social problems of the time, and limit himself to personal agony or personal suffering or personal existence. So here is where so there are different shades of this kind of poetry as well that you see that is written in the 1930s. Again, when we speak of these poets, then there is another poet, Sudhindranath Datta, who is writing in the same way, and is also projecting a kind of modernist streak in his poetry. So, so these poets then become the kind of cult figures during the 1930s or so, when Bengali poetry looks up for them for inspiration. But soon you find that this trend is broken by another kind of writing that comes to the fore, and this you find in the case of Subash Mukhopadhyay, who in 1940s takes center stage and writes a poetry of just the opposite of what has been written in the 1930s. He writes about social problems, he writes about commitment, he writes about equality, and taking the tradition of Qazi Nazrul Islam further. Subash Mukhopadhyay actually registers that kind of new kind of poetry that you see. He is known as the Padatik, which came out in 1940 as the volume of poetry. Now, if I could just read certain sections from Subash Mukhopadhyay, just to give you an idea of this kind of social or change oriented poetry that you find at this particular period. Now, along with Subash Mukhopadhyay, you also have somebody called Vishnu, whose writing whose writing is a blend, I would say, of both, has certain elements of the existential modernist streak, but also understands social reality to be an important part of life, and one cannot run away from it. He actually kind of becomes the kind of bridge between Subash Mukhopadhyay and the earlier modernists, and he's also senior to Subash Mukhopadhyay by say about 8-9 years. And then he's he talks about Vishnu then talks about this kind of social life and social problems. And before I go to Subash Mukhopadhyay, let me read out a poem by Vishnu, so we can see how change is taking place in Bengali poetry. Now, his poem is titled Bami. So, Bami, he says, you all know Bami. Remember that little girl Bami, who on a starlit spring night had burst into tears on the rooftop and said, I'm lost in the darkness? I wonder how that scared little Bami will find her way under the dark night sky. How she will find her way upstairs, on the stairs and downstairs in this dark life, where cockroaches lick and devour books and artwork, spiders spin their webs, and gecko lizards hunt cockroaches, where there is no respect for creators, artists, poets and lovers. In the crowded darkness of this terrible and hateful life, I wonder how that little girl Bami will grow up. How from childhood youth to middle and old age, she will find peace and fulfillment. how protecting her pure soul like a lamp by the border of a sari, she will settle the soiled demands of this dark world. I wonder how she will light up this darkness into lasting and shining glory. So, do you see this kind of the way the poet is trying to, it's more dialectical in that sense, because it seems to go in the direction of light and then pitches darkness. So, he sees some hope and some light there, and yet he knows that the world is dark, that does not value poets, does not value lovers, and in such a girl, in such a world, how will this girl survive? It's a young girl he's talking about. What is interesting about Vishnu is also that he constantly talks about the woman subject, as an important figure in life, as an important aspect of life, the woman's experience. He's able to transfer and move beyond his personal and go into the experience of the woman.
Dr. Bajaj, you talked about darkness in the case of Vishnu. There's poem Bami, and that's a little girl. So this darkness is occurring so many times, occurring this word so many times, and it has so many connotations that, and you have worked on Muktibodh, who also talks of darkness. So what are the implications of darkness in this poem with respect to other people using the word?
Yes, of course. Again, why I was struck by this poem was that I thought Vishnu was able to talk about darkness as also in the same way as Muktibodh does, in the sense of not knowing what is going to happen, in the sense that the unknowable, or not the unknowable, but in that sense what is still latent and what is still hidden, and he hopes that this darkness would lead to light, and as he says, I wonder how she will light up this darkness. So the idea is that she's going to find light, but he knows that the path is bleak and dark. I think when both Vishnu and Muktibodh, when they talk about darkness, then they are not referring to darkness as an end to where one is moving, but darkness on the way, darkness in the process, and darkness in both senses, as in that which is hidden, that which is invisible, that which is in the dark, and also darkness in the sense of the bleak circumstance that one is going through, and the grim reality that one has to face. But
and it is a positive word.
Yeah, it is a positive word in the sense that darkness is there in the process, but not in the result, or at the end. It's not, even Vishnu knows that Bami is going to find light, but he also knows that there are many troubles that she is going to find on the way.
Is Bami the common person of India somehow?
I think she represents that innocent figure, and he sees innocence to be as represented in a little girl. And so therefore he's talking about the innocent mass of people, the innocent group in people who are trying to find way. And it is more bleak. Life is bleak for the innocent. If you are cunning and you're clever and you're smart, so to speak, then you have already found your way.
And it's a little girl that is chosen to represent Indian masses.
Right.
What does it signify?
Again, the idea of innocence, the idea of innocence, and also this kind of uncluttered knowledge that one might have, also this sense of not preconceived notions about things, somebody who would also be free of weighing tradition and orthodoxy that you see in life. So somebody who's a child or necessarily represents all these attributes, and adding the girl attribute obviously heightens that this is a sensitive person one is talking about. So it's a blend of the sensitive and the innocent, with the new kind of knowledge that she is going to build based on her experiences.
In that sense, poetry takes modernism as something that is to be rejected, but this kind of evocation as something that is to be accepted and projected.
Yes, that is true, and which is why I said this is the shift that I'm talking about, from modernism to this new kind of writing, where the poet now is not is not warped in one's subjective experience and is able to transfer emotions to other people around him. In this case, Vishnu is able to transfer this emotion to this young girl and become that young girl and talk about her experiences. So when the experience of the poet connects with the experience of the young girl, then the scope is widened and becomes open to include more people in it. So you can see that this kind of shift taking place in the poetic sensibility in Bengal at in this particular period. And so from here, Subash Mukhopadhyay is more pronounced and is very clear in terms of his position, and is clearly on the side of equality and socialism and other aspects of life. So if I could just also in the given time speak about Subash Mukhopadhyay and the strain that he takes in poetry, he's clear on what he wants to represent here as well. And he says in one of his poems titled My Task, I want my words to stand straight on their feet. I want every shade should have eyes. I want every static picture to walk. I don't want to be called a poet. I want to walk on shoulder to shoulder till my last day. I want to put down my pen beside the tractor and say how I'm free. Brother, may I have a little fire? So you see, there is a kind of clarity here that the poet projects through this poem, My Task. He knows his task, and he knows that he is working through words, his task, and through his tools, that is the pen here. He wants to walk shoulder to shoulder with other men, and does not want to be called a poet. When he says, I don't wish to be called a poet, which means that he doesn't want to be this elite intellectual figure that is necessarily pedestalized in life, and wants to be seen as more like a workman who works with his tools, and would one day keep his tools aside and call it a day. So there is a kind of clarity so far as his role is concerned, his work is concerned, his task is concerned, when we are talking about Subash Mukhopadhyay. And his poems are, in that sense, talk about the problems that people face, and talk about envision a world where where there'll be a red day, and that's the title of one of his poems. And he talks about then in another poem, he says, for one poem, a poem will be written. For that the sky rids in anger like blue flames. Look at the imagery. He's talking about the sky that rids in anger like blue flames. None of that mystical quality that you associate with the sky, or with the blue sky, or with the peaceful, harmonious sky. In fact, here the sky is represented. The image that is given is that of blue flames. It's more like everything is involved in this revolutionary activity, and so the sky joins in. The storm sheds its wings on the sea. The smoky skein of clouds unfurls. The din of thunder shakes the woods. The panic of fall sways the roots. The lightning turns around. In that gleam sees its face. In that red mirror the burnt eye. For him a poem is written. So he's talking about the figure of this poet rebel, of this revolutionary figure who's going to change the world. A poem will be written, for that the decree of future is writ on walls. The procession goes on. The fear of death, the songs pervade the sky. The new world is conceived in their roar. In their eyes, infinite happiness, infinite love. A poem is written for that. So it's as if the poet was celebrating this kind of, this kind of vigor that is there in life, this kind of moving towards this kind of change-oriented life. And he says the new world is going to be conceived through in the roar. You see, it's not a passive acceptance. It's not also that the poet is just looking from a distance. He's a part of this activity. He's a part of the procession. He's a part of this roar and conceiving a new world in the process.
How is poetry shaping in the last 20 years, last 30 years?
The last 20-30 years, if we speak about, and here we are talking about the new poets, such as Goswami is there, and there is, interestingly, I was trying to find in this any woman poet if I could find, and I could manage only to find Mandakranta Sen, who's written a poem titled A Strange Affair. And when she writes about this poem, then she writes about the poem in the sense that, talking about an affair with a man, and finally she says that I'll yell to skies, Indra uncle is my lover. So, there's a kind of, breaking tradition and orthodoxy that you find in the poetry of Mandakranta Sen. And she's born in 1972, so a new poet on the block. But this kind of sensibility of breaking tradition and yelling and this kind of aggression in the new generation is to be seen here. And in the case of this woman poet, you actually find she's a Sahitya Academy winner as well. So you find that she's trying to assert herself, her decision as a woman, and break away from tradition. Even when if it is her uncle is her lover, she would yell to the skies and let all know, and breaking in fact the norms of matrimony and of the set norms in society. So that's the new kind of woman poet that you find on the block in Bengali literature. But also along with her, there is a poet called Joy Goswami, who's born in 1954, and this poet you find is writing a very different kind of poetry, very dark and somber kind of poetry he's writing, where he's talking about graves, and he talks about his mother's corpse and how the brother and the sister are trying to live out their days carrying the corpse of the mother.
What future do you see of this kind of poetry? Any idea?
So the future, it's deliberately, this kind of poetry is deliberately trying to be vague in certain respects. It's using that kind of ideas that are yoked together, so to speak, very disconnected fragments that are yoked together. It's more used as a kind of technique in the present day poetry, and using particularly very grim kind of pictures and images so as to shock the reader. So the shock element, to shock the reader, is one of their new points that they've hit upon. But I don't know, somehow there is a kind of lack of I think that kind of zest, or lack of that kind of vigor that you saw in earlier poets, and maybe that has a lot to do with the times that the poets are living in. And yeah.
So friends, we have had a very extensive discussion on Bengali poetry, starting from the 1920s when Nazrul Islam came into his own, up to the present time when Dr. Richa Bajaj says that there is a future, but there is a vagueness about it, and that things are fragmented. So I believe that poets will find their way out, and they'll reach a kind of sense of unity, a sense of cohesion, if at all, and if not, then there is an expression of freedom so far as poetry is concerned. So thanks Dr. Richa Bajaj, and viewers, these are the points that one has to consider in the case of Bengali poetry of the contemporary period, and lots of questions have been thrown, and I think we should work them out in our own way as the discussion goes on in the world of culture. Thank you, and thank you Dr. Richa Bajaj.
Thank you.